Okay, folks, here we are for our first main philosophical topic. In the course, we're going to look at the metaphysical problem of personal identity in Rick and Morty, of course, right? So the problem of personal identity gets raised in Rick and Morty in a lot of different ways. And it's easy to pick up on, it's pretty straightforward how the issue arises in Rick and Morty, because in the Rick and Morty multiverse, there are an infinite number of Ricks, an infinite number of Jerrys, an infinite number of Beths, and so on, right? So in Rick and Morty, reality is comprised of a multiverse. There's an infinite number of parallel, actually existing universes, rather than just hypothetical or logically possible worlds. Across the infinite number of universes, there are an infinite number of Ricks, Jerrys, Mortys, Summers, and Beths, and so on. So this raises a question. What, if anything, makes Rick C-137, the Rick that we follow through the series, or presumably follow through the series, for example, the same individual as Rick C-138 or Rick C-478, right? In other words, given that there are all these different Ricks, what makes them Ricks, right? What is it that makes them the same individual across the multiverse, if anything, right? If anything. So another way in which the problem of personal identity gets raised in Rick and Morty is through this idea of cloning, which pops up several times. Or in the, well, I'll come back to the other episode here. So for example, in the most recent season, we have Rick transferring his person, it seems, to different bodies that are identical to his original body, replicas, right? So as I write here in Edge of Morty, Rick, die, repeat. Rick repeatedly transfers his memories or consciousness, or what we might call his person, his identity, into clones of himself. Does that make the clones the same as the original, the replicas the same as the original? So again, what, if anything, makes the clones of Rick the same person as the original Rick? What, if anything, makes Rick C-137, who returns to his family after a long absence in the beginning of the series, right, the same Rick C-137 that left his wife and daughter earlier in time? Starting to raise the problem of personal identity over time. Persistence of identity over time. So a more simple way of asking it is, I'm 47 years old now. What makes me, if anything, makes me the same person that I am today as the individual that had long hair, if you can imagine it, when I was 19, and further the same individual, if anything, that makes me the same individual that I am today as I was when I was an infant, right? So this is a metaphysical question. Philosophy, one of the big areas in academic philosophy is metaphysics, and that's the area of philosophy that deals with studies the nature of ultimate reality. In other words, what constitutes reality? How do we distinguish real from fake, or that which is not real? So some basic questions in metaphysics include, what is the nature of existence? Are human beings comprised of a physical and a non-physical mental properties, or are they all physical things, right? Materialism is the view that the only stuff that exists and that reality is comprised only of matter, energy, or physical stuff, right? Bodies in some form or another. Do human beings have free will, or are their actions determined by factors beyond their control? So again, we could worry about the problem of political freedom, but the metaphysical problem of free will is about the nature of human persons, whether or not we have genuine free will or that's an illusion. Do any supernatural beings exist? So the question of God's existence is a metaphysical question. And the problem, or problems rather, of personal identity are metaphysical issues. So a couple of different issues arise with regard to personal identity in terms of metaphysics. What am I, right? Am I fundamentally an immaterial soul or a non-physical mind, or am I fundamentally a body, a material thing? Who am I, right? And what, if anything, makes me one and the same person over time or across the multiverse, right? So again, I ask here alternatively for our purposes, what, if anything, makes the Ricks from different universes Ricks? What is it that personal identity consists of? So we'll worry about that last question primarily, the question of persistence over time. So although the problem of personal identity that we're going to deal with seems like an abstract and metaphysical issue that maybe doesn't have any relationship to practical concerns at all. You might start off thinking that, but if you think about it, really, personal identity does have something to do with a practical matter. And so as you read in the essay that was assigned for this section, the problem of personal identity connects up to the idea of moral responsibility. It seems like if we're going to have justified accountability in terms of morality, praising people for what they did, or blaming people for what they did, that we need to praise or blame the same individual for what they did, right? So as Lay points out in his article, the Council of Ricks operates on what philosophers sometimes call the traditional view of personal identity. And a good example of the traditional view comes from John Locke. And that's the idea that numerical identity is what is important and matters, and is what's important in regard to the relationship between personal identity and moral responsibility. So what exactly is this traditional view? That's one of the things we'll look at in this section in more depth. I pulled out lots of passages from Locke here for us to consider. And we need to keep in mind some key ideas, right, that are kind of related to one another and are important for for understanding the question of personal identity in the first place, and then of course trying to resolve it if we can. Here we're going to get an example where the contemporary philosopher we look at challenges the traditional philosophical view, right, Locke's view. So one idea we may keep in mind here is this idea of Leibniz's law, and that's the dictum that if two individual things are the same type of thing, so Rick C137 and Rick 490, right? If those two individual objects are the same sort of thing, namely a Rick, then they have to share all the same essential or intrinsic properties or necessary properties and fail to share none. Right? That's one way of thinking about that, and that this idea of Leibniz's law is central to the mind-body problem as well. The mind-body problem is another metaphysical issue. The problem is, how, if at all, does a non-material, non-physical mind relate to the body? Exactly how are those two things connected there, right? So a related issue to personal identity, you might want to say, well, look, the self, the personal identity consists of the same non-physical mind, right? And so picking up on this idea of Leibniz's law and the idea of an essential property, we can distinguish between essential or necessary properties and contingent properties, right? So a necessary property is a property or characteristic that a thing cannot lack without becoming a different kind of thing or ceasing to be altogether. And a contingent property is a characteristic that a thing can lose or gain without becoming a different kind of thing or ceasing to be altogether. So for example, it looks like having hair is a contingent property, but having the same consciousness, same mind, or same memories would be like more of an example of a necessary property, right? So if we're going to say that I'm the same individual now that I was back when I was 19, we could take away the property of being bald or having a full head of hair without changing the identity of that thing, right? So for example, across the multiverse, there are Ricks that have different haircuts, right? But we all think of them as Ricks, right? So you wouldn't be able to take away the property of having hair or a different haircut and say that it's a different thing. It's not a Rick anymore. And so with regard to this problem of personal identity, we get these two notions of identity that are important to distinguish, although they seemingly have a relationship to one another. The first is a qualitative identity. And that's the logical or conceptual relationship that describes similarities or sameness of shared characteristics between two or more things. A one-to-many relationship. So there we have the idea of multiple Ricks that have qualitative differences, different haircuts, right? Different hairstyles. That would be, so that they qualitatively differ there, but we still want to call them Ricks, right? So what does that identity consist of? So for example, pit bulls and poodles share some qualities, some qualitative similarities that make them canines, right? So qualitative identity seems to be a matter of degree or proportion. Or to give another example, two white pool balls, two cue balls are qualitatively identical. They have the same color, but they're numerically different. They're different objects. At least they're different in having different locations, right? So they're not in the same location. So qualitative difference seems to be a matter of degree there, right? And then there's numerical identity. And so as the article mentions, and this will be the same for this lecture, when I'm talking about identity, if I just use the word identity, I'm going to try to restrict my use there to numerical identity, because that's what's the issue about personal identity seems to be focused on numerical identity. So that's the conceptual or logical relationship between a thing and itself. So it's a self relation in terms of being one and the same thing over time. So it's not a one-to-many relationship, that's a one-to-one relationship. What makes me the same individual over time? That has to do with numerical identity. And the idea here is that numerical identity is what's important in the traditional view, and that numerical identity requires total or complete qualitative identity, right? So that's the basic idea here. So here's this problem of personal identity, or the problem of persistence of personal identity over time. We get three basic views in philosophy, three views we would start out considering, although we're not going to consider all of them in this lecture or in the reading. We're going to focus on what seems to be the case in Rick and Morty, or the views that fit most with Rick and Morty. But I want you to just know that there are a couple of others, even though we're not going to consider all of them. So if you're interested in them, you can look stuff up on them, or ask me for information about them, or to look for more information about them, right? So here's this problem then of the traditional problem of persistence of personal identity over time. Given that there are many changes in my physical and psychological properties over time, what, if anything, makes me the same person, right? So three basic attempts to answer that question, right? And Parfit's view is kind of it's a contemporary view that takes issue with the kind of traditional, the Lockean view here. So sometimes Parfit's view is called the bundle theory, which is different than either of these three views. So first we have the soul theory. Rene Descartes is someone who would hold an example of that kind of theory. And it's the view that person A at time 1 is identical to person B at time 2, if and only if, that's the language of necessary and sufficient conditions in philosophy, if and only if A and B possess the numerically same or identical non-physical soul, right? So an immaterial soul. So according to this view, if you took that immaterial soul out of one body and put it in another body, even a very different body, it would be the same person, right? Then there's the memory view. And this is our psychological view, sometimes the consciousness view. This is Locke's an example of this view here. So this is the position that person A at time 1 is identical to person B at a later time 2, if and only if A and B share, only if A and B, if B remembers all the stuff that A did, right? So I say if and only if, I kind of jumbled that up here. It should be the position that person A at time 1 is identical to person B at time 2, if and only if A and B remember being the same person, right? So in other words, if person B has all the same memories as person A, they're the same individual, same person, right? Personal identity, they have the same identity. Then we get the bodily view. So this isn't a view that we'll discuss much either in this lecture or that's discussed much in the reading, but a contemporary philosopher, he's passed away now, but a contemporary living, he's deceased, but he was a 20th and 21st century philosopher who was influential for personal identities, Bernard Williams. So according to this view, it's the view that a person A at time 1 is identical to person B at time 2, if and only if A and B have the same body. So you can see what kinds of problems already start to arise for these views. So for the soul theory, how would we know if it's the same soul, right? How does this immaterial soul move back between bodies? How is it attached to bodies? Problem, a personal mind-body problem. Memory view, given that I don't have all the same memories, am I really the same person as before? And given that my body changes over time, how could I ever have total qualitative identity to have numerical identity, be the same person? All right, so let's look at Locke's view. And what I've done here is just pulled out some key quotes from Locke's essay concerning human understanding in one of his thought experiments that he used to flesh out his view of personal identity. So let's take a look at these quotations here. First, we're going to start off with a thought experiment, Locke's Prince and Cobbler thought experiment. Right? So cobbler, someone that makes shoes. And philosophers use thought experiments in different ways. Sometimes it's to identify a foundational, it's used as a, as a prompt for thinking through an issue, like is going to be used here, or as part of an argument for formulating an argument for a view, identifying a fundamental intuition that we think is the basis of a view, testing logical consistency between thought experiments, this sort of thing. Right? So here's Locke's Prince and Cobbler thought experiment, and then we'll look at his response to it. Right? So he says, for should the soul of a prince carry with it the consciousness or memories of the prince's past life, and enter into and inform the body of a cobbler, as soon as deserted by his own soul, everyone sees that he would be the same person with the principle accountable only for the actions, but who would say it's the same man? So what Locke is doing here is he's distinguishing man from person, man having the body, different bodies, but it's the same person because he's got the same consciousness, right? So if it's the prince's consciousness going into the body of a cobbler after that soul or consciousness had been vacated, Locke wants to say if the cobbler's body remembers the prince's life, then it's the same person. So personal identity, he says, this being premised, to find wherein personal identity consists, we must consider what person stands for. In other words, what does the word person stand for? Which I think is a thinking, intelligent being that has reason and reflection and can consider itself as itself. So remember, numerical identity is about the relationship of a thing between a thing and itself, right? The same thinking thing in different times and places, which it does only by that consciousness, which is inseparable from thinking, and, as it seems to me, essential to it. It being impossible for one to perceive without perceiving that he does perceive. When we see, hear, smell, taste, feel, meditate, or will anything, we know that we do so. Locke is an example of an empiricist philosopher. He thinks that all knowledge comes from sense experience, right? And our memories, so we're born a tabula rasa, blank slate, and we get memories through the sense experiences riding on our consciousness, filling in our consciousness, basically. So the upshot here is having the same memories of doing things means that I'm the same individual. I'm the same person, even if I have a different body, right? That's what he means by man. So thus, it is always as to our present sensations and perceptions, and by this everyone is to himself that which he calls self, it not being considered in the case whether the same self be continued in the same or diverse substances, different bodies. For since consciousness always accompanies thinking, and it is that which makes everyone to be what one calls self, and thereby distinguishes himself from all the other thinking things, in this alone consists personal identity. In other words, that's i.e., right? In other words, the sameness of a rational being. And this, as far as his consciousness can be extended backwards, memory, to any past action or thought, so far reaches the identity of that person. It is one and the same self now as it was then, and it is by the same self, which this present one that now reflects on it, that an action was done, right? So moral accountability then requires, if you're going to hold me responsible or punish me for something or praise me for something, the being that you praise or hold responsible or praise or blame has to remember doing that thing. So, but it is further inquired whether it be the same identical substance. This view would think they had reason to doubt of if the perceptions with their consciousness always remain present in the mind, whereby the same thinking thing would always be consciously present, and as it would be thought evidently the same to itself. So again, we're getting numerical identity is what's driving the issue here. It's the relationship I have with myself that makes me the same individual over time. And what does that relationship consist of? Me having those memories. Right? So, but that which seems to make the difficulty is this, that this consciousness being interrupted always by forgetfulness, there being no moment of our lives wherein we have the whole train of all our past actions before our eyes in one view, but even the best memories losing the sight of one part whilst they are viewing another, and we sometimes, and that the greatest part of our lives, not reflecting on our past selves, being intent on our present thoughts, and in sound sleep having no thoughts at all, or at least none, with that consciousness which remarks our waking thoughts. So he's raising well, what about when you go to sleep? Isn't that a break in memory? I say in all these cases, our consciousness being interrupted and we losing the sight of our past selves, doubts are raised whether we are one and the same thinking thing, i.e. the same substance or no. So he's raising the question, are we the same substance if we have this forgetful elements, or if our consciousness and memories are interrupted by things like sleep? And we'll come back to an amnesia case later. So he says, which, however, reasonable and unreasonable concerns not personal identity at all. The question being, what makes the same person, and not whether it be the same identical substance, body, which always thinks and is thinks in the same person, which in this case matters not at all. Different substances by the same consciousness, where they do partake in it, being united into one person, as well as different bodies by the same life are united into one animal, whose identity is preserved in that change of substances by the unity of one continued life. So he's not thinking of life here just simply, he's thinking about his conscious life, not just simply biological life, because that would obviously involve different substances. So metaphysically, for it being the same consciousness that makes a man be himself to himself, personal identity depends on that only, whether it be annexed solely into one individual substance or can be continued in a succession of several substances, like clones, for example, in Rick and Morty. For as far as any intelligent being can repeat the idea of any past action with the same consciousness it had of it at first, and with the same consciousness it has of any present action, so far as it be the same personal self. For it is by the consciousness it has of its present thoughts and actions that it is a self to itself now, and so will remain the same self, persistence over time. As for the same consciousness can be extended to past actions or to come, and would be by distance of time or change of substance, no more two persons than may be two men by wearing their other clothes to that today than he did yesterday. So differences qualitatively, right? That's not what's important. It's the essential characteristic of memory that is driving the view of personal identity here. So with a long or short sleep between, the same consciousness uniting those two distant actions into the same person, whatever substances contributed to their production. So he says, consciousness alone unites actions into the same person. Same psychology, same consciousness, same memories. Continuity of psychological states, right? So we're going to have a distinction there pop up with our next thinker, Parfit. But though the same immaterial substance or soul does not alone, whenever it be in whatever state, make the same man, yet it is plain consciousness as far as can ever be extended should should it be to the ages past, unites existences and actions very remote in time into the same person. So whatever the consciousness of present and past actions is the same person to whom they both belong. Had I the same consciousness that I saw the ark and Noah's flood, as I saw the overflowing of the Thames last winter, or it's a different river, or as that I right now, I could no more doubt than I who write this now that saw the Thames overflowed last winter and that viewed the flood and the general deluge as the same self. Place that self in what substance you please, the prince's body, the cobbler's body. Then I write these two, this am the same self whilst I write now. Right? So whether I consist of all the same substance, material or immaterial or no. So there's Locke rejecting the somatic or the bodily view. It's not the same body across time that matters. It's the same consciousness. The continuity of that consciousness, even in different bodies, makes the same person. Same self, same identity. So I being as much concerned and as justly accountable for any action that was done 1,000 years ago, appropriate to me now by this self-consciousness as I am what I did the last moment. So again, it's the relationship is between a thing and itself here, a self and itself. And so if I have the same memories as a past self, I'm the same individual. I'm the same person. So self is that which that is that conscious thinking thing, whatever substance made up of, whether it's spiritual stuff, immaterial, simple, or compounded, it matters not, which is sensible in consciousness of pleasure and pain, capable of happiness and misery, and so is concerned for itself as far as that consciousness extends. Thus, everyone finds that whilst comprehended under that consciousness, a little finger is as much a part of himself as that which is most so. Upon separation, this little finger, should this consciousness go along with the little finger and leave the rest of the body, it is evident the little finger would be the same person. The same person. So it's not the substances, the physics that matter. It's the same continuity of consciousness that matters for personal identity. So the upshot here when it comes to punishment and reward, in this personal identity is founded all the right and just of reward and punishment, happiness and misery being that for which everyone is concerned for himself and not mattering what becomes of any substance not joined or affected with that consciousness. So drop down a little bit. Though if the same body should still live and immediately from the separation of that little finger have its own peculiar consciousness, again with the finger example, whereof the little finger knew nothing, it would not at all be concerned for it as a part of itself, or could own any of its actions or have any of them imputed to it. So the idea for Locke is that sameness and continuity of memory and consciousness is what is the basis for numerical identity. That's what makes things one and the same. And to get more technical for just a second about it, Locke is concerned with the difference between actual and dubious memories. They have to be actual memories and they have to be connected to one another, right? That's what forms this continuity of consciousness. All right, so to bring it back to Rick and Morty here, although a different episode than is discussed, at least I don't recall off the top of my head that Morty's mind blower is being discussed in Lay's article. We could ask ourselves a question with regard to Locke's theory here. So in this episode of Rick and Morty, Morty discovers that Rick has erased lots of his memories. And then he goes into this vault where they're all stored, and then he understands what happened to him in the past. So according to Locke's theory, which requires sameness or continuity of consciousness and memory, so according to Locke's theory, is Morty, at the time he learns his memories have been erased, identical to or the same Morty that had those experiences, or rather just before he learns that they were erased? Or is it the case that the current Morty is different from the previous Mortys because he doesn't share their memory? Well, so there's kind of like an amnesia case there. Here's Locke's response to both amnesia and the case of drunkenness, where we don't remember what happens. So in the first case, Locke seems willing to say they're different people. So he says, suppose I'm I wholly lose the memory of some parts of my life beyond a possibility of retrieving them, so that perhaps I shall never be conscious of them again, yet I am not the same person that did those actions and those thoughts that I was once conscious of, though I have now forgotten them. So Locke's, in this case, Locke seems to follow the implications of his theory that if you had these life-altering memories that were erased, you would not be the same person that had them. So even more contemporary, what if we were able to chemically erase some of your memories of traumatic events? You would be different than the person that underwent those events, those traumatic events. In the case of drunkenness, Locke seems to run counter to what many of us would probably want to do here. So he says, but it is not a man drunk and sober the same person. Why else is he punished for the fact he commits when drunk, though he is never afterwards conscious of it? Just as the same person as a man that walks and does other things in his sleep is the person, and it is the same person and is answerable for any mischief he shall do in it. So he's considering some possible objections to his view here. Right. So that's Locke's view. We could formulate an argument here, since this is just our first main topic. I'm going to skip doing that this time around, but notice that the argument would go something like this. If the cobbler remembers the life of the prince, or has the same memories as the prince, then the cobbler is identical to the prince, right? That would be the basic premise in his argument here. Parfit, contemporary philosopher that just died a few years ago, is going to take issue with that traditional view, that Lockean view. And it looks like, as Lay points out in his article that you read for today, that the Council of Ricks operates on a kind of Lockean traditional view, that numerical identity is what matters to us about the issue of personal identity, and that numerical identity is rooted in that memory. That's why they go off hunting for a particular Rick rather than just grabbing one, any old Rick. Right? They want to find the one who is responsible for murdering other Ricks and kidnapping their Mortys. All right, so here's Derek Parfit, again, a contemporary philosopher. The basic idea that we want to get out of Parfit is that personal identity doesn't really matter. So that's contrary to Locke's view and the traditional view. He says psychological connectedness matters, but it's a matter of degree. And remember that numerical identity requires total qualitative identity. And so he's going to present us with some cases where personal identity and sameness or continuity of psychological states or memories seem to come apart. Locke thought that they were together. That's why I mentioned that main premise in the Lockean argument would be that if the cobbler has all the same memories as the prince, then they are identical. Then the cobbler is identical to the prince. Actually, let's just go ahead and formulate a little argument here. So let's back up here and insert a panel, and I'll just formulate Locke's argument for us here. Number my premises. So if the cobbler has the same memories is identical to the prince. In other words, they are the same person or self. We saw Locke use that language there. So if the cobbler remembers or has the same memories as the prince, thus the cobbler is identical to the prince. They're the same person. So here's that argument then that we formulated, and we can think about how Parfit's thought experiments and his views, what premise or premises in this argument do they challenge? So again, Parfit's going to claim, based on another thought experiment, or really a couple of thought experiments that he uses, that personal identity and psychological continuity come apart, and that what is really important to us, what the language that he uses, what matters to us really is psychological connectedness not being numerically identical. So he distinguishes two questions of personal identity. The first is the identity question or continuity question, and then the second is the survival question. And he's going to claim what matters to us is really our survival that doesn't require numerical identity. And so we're going to look at two thought experiments. One of them matches up really, really well with Rick and Morty, as discussed in the reading. Then look at Parfit's responses to those. So here's the first thought experiment. And the full thought experiment's a little longer than this, but we can just use this little section of it here. And so this kind of goes along with the episode of Rick and Morty. Because in Rick and Morty, we have this idea of consciousness, memories, sameness of memories going into different bodies, right? Many different bodies in some cases, right? Sometimes that memory goes into a member of the Intergalactic Federation, one of the aliens here. So that would make the alien body the same as Rick, right? So here's the thought experiment. It's a teletransporter thought experiment. In the reading, they talk about the brainalyzer, right, from Rick and Morty. So suppose that you enter a cubicle in which you press a button. A scanner records the states of all the cells in your brain and body, destroying both while doing so. This information is transmitted at the speed of light to some other planet, where a replicator produces a perfect organic copy of you, a clone, a replica. It's exactly what happens in Rick and Morty, especially in Rick, The Edge of Morty, Rick, die, repeat. What repeats is different bodies, so same consciousness, or same memories, presumably. So since the brain of your replica is exactly like yours, it will seem to remember everything living your life up to that moment when you pressed the button. Its character will be just like yours, and it will be, in every other way, psychologically continuous with you. So then the question is the replica you? Are you the same? Are you identical to, is the replica identical to the original? So again, take a minute here and think about how you would answer that question, just as a prompt for thinking reflectively and critically about either your own intuitions about personal identity, and then you can test them about against these arguments and start thinking about whether, well, should I revise are there contradictions in my view about personal identity? Should I revise it? And so forth, right? So these thought experiments, one way of using them is just as a way of getting people thinking critically and reflectively about what their views really are, as at least a starting point for doing philosophy. And then trying to discern contradictions among other beliefs that we might have. Right, so is the replica you? So with these thought experiments, you always want to, usually I give these as a graded assignment. I'm not doing that with y'all just because I thought overloading you with one more assignment in such a quick class would be a little bit much. But I do want you to think about these things. So pause the video for a second and think about how you would answer that question. Is the replica identical to you that pressed the button in the cubicle? And in the rest of this thought experiments, the replica ends up on Mars, right? So it ends up in a different space, different place. So you always need to take into account the working assumptions of the thought experiment. So in this case, we have the technology for a teletransporter. So your answer needs to take into that. Don't just dismiss the idea because we don't have any teletransporters that we know about, right? And then you want to try and give a thorough answer, a thoughtful answer to it. So at least a paragraph, 5 to 7 sentences minimum. And really think about the question before you offer your response. And of course, always try and give a reason for whatever conclusion you're asserting there. So if you think the replica is you, what makes you think, or what reason would you give to defend that view? Start to move in the direction of not just expressing a belief or an opinion, but giving reasons and arguments to justify the truth of those. Right? All right, so hopefully you took a few minutes to answer that question, that first thought experiment. We'll see another one pop up here in a minute. Again, let's just remember some of our basic views, and I'm going to narrow it further from those 3 basic views we looked at earlier. So consider the physical criterion for personal identity. If we go with that view, so in the soul view, we would have to figure out how the soul in the original you got put into the replica and what's involved in that. So there's a problem of interaction there. So that would be one issue to worry about there. With regard to the somatic or physical criteria, the answer to the thought experiment looks like it's not the same you because it's not the same body. It's a replica. So according to that view, your physical continuity has been disrupted. It's not you. You are not identical to the replica. According to the psychological criteria, we have a slightly different view here. So according to the Lockean view, if psychological continuity depends on the body and brain, then you die, you don't survive, and the replica is not you either, right? So if memory depends on something physical, then it's not you. You're not identical to the replica. B, if psychological continuity depends on something else like cellular information, then you are the replica. You're identical to that replica. So we might ask ourselves, what's really going on in Rick and Morty in these transfers of consciousness? Are they transmitting something? What are they doing? Copying and transmitting information, right? Like my computer does with files. That kind of looks like what's going on in Rick and Morty, right? So the problem with these views is that we need to decide in some impartial, non-arbitrary way, which is hard to do, just how much of my body or how much of my memory persists in order to establish numerical identity between the original and the replica. Right? So that's one issue to worry about there. Here's Parfit's response to his teletransporter response. So you can think about how you responded and then think about how Parfit responded and then the reasons that he gives for his response. So he says, there's no unified self or person. This is Parfit's view. He claims, that here's the quote, there are a long series of different mental states and events, thoughts, sensations, and the like, each series being what we call one life. So he's got a bit of a different view here. He uses this example of a club or an organization. So consider a philosophy club at LSU or the Saints, the football team, right? Are the Saints today, that organization today, is it the same team that won the Super Bowl in 2000, what was it, 9? I think they won, right? Somebody out there check my year. I think it was 2009 when the Saints won the Super Bowl. Well, they got the same name, right? Some parts of the team are the same. Some individuals, Drew Brees is still on the team, for example, but many other, the coach is still the same, right? But, or at least the head coach is still the same. Is it the same team, right? So we'll come back to this here. All right, so what Parfit thinks that teletransporter case shows is that numerical identity, which is supposed to be what matters to us in terms of personal identity, and psychological continuity separate. So there are 2 basic takeaways Parfit thinks. The original and the replica cannot be identical, right? So the same thing cannot be in 2 different places at the same time, on Earth, where the original is, and on Mars, where the replica is. That would involve a contradiction. So the same thing can't be in 2 different spaces, 2 different places, rather, at the same time in the same respect. So there's that notion of a contradiction coming in as a reason for accepting one view versus another. If my view of personal identity implies that 2 things, 2 separate objects are the same thing, but they have to have total qualitative identity, well, then they can't be the same. There's a contradiction that's generated there. The second takeaway is that the original and the replica do, however, seem to be psychologically continuous with one another. The replica simply picks up where the original left off, right? So that we get psychological continuity, but a contradiction with regard to identity. So he thinks that that shows that, contrary to Locke's view, that identity, numerical identity, is not linked to really necessarily to psychological continuity. They can come apart. So, well, the big upshot that Parfit draws from this is that identity isn't really what matters. What matters is psychological continuity. That's a matter of degree, though. So here's another thought experiment. I don't believe, at least I'd have to double check, I don't think Lay discusses this one in the Unimportance of Identity article. This one's the fission example. So again, here we have a thought experiment. He said, Parfit says, my body is fatally injured, and as are the brains of my two brothers. My brain is divided, and each half is successfully transplanted into the body of one of my brothers. Each of the resulting people believes that he is me, seems to remember living my life, psychological continuity, has my character, and is in every other way psychologically continuous with me. And he has a body that's very much like mine. So you can think of what Locke's answer would be, since it has the same memories. These two individuals are the same person as the original. We start to look for a contradiction again there, right? And then Parfit asked, what happens to me? Right? So this survival question here. So pause again, pause the video here again, and think about how you would answer that question. What happens to me if my brain is taken out of my damaged body, divided into two other individuals, and those two other individuals have all the same memories as the original? All right, so hopefully you took a few minutes and thought up an answer to that thought experiment as well. Parfit considers four possibilities, four possible ways of thinking about that question, what happens to me? First, we might say that I don't survive. But, as I point out here, since he would survive if his whole brain were successfully transplanted, and because people do survive without half an injured brain, one cannot be correct. So that's a logical possibility that I don't survive, but we should reject that possibility because it's actually possible for people to survive with half an injured brain, right? After physical brain damage. Right? So one cannot be correct. It can't be the case that I don't really survive. 2 and 3 are mirror images of one another, inversions of one another. So I survive as brother 2, but not brother 3. I survive as brother 3, but not brother 2. Remember, the brains are split in half, and each person gets one and has psychological continuity with the original. But in both cases, in the case of both options 2 and 3, if the two halves are identical, then which one is me? What criteria could we use to determine which one is me? So there's that question of personal identity popping up there. So we run into some problems that don't look like they have answers there. And then 4, the last possibility that he entertains is that I survive as both 2 and 3, but that would be contradictory because the same person can't be in 2 different bodies at the same time or 2 different places at the same time. So again, we run into that notion of, looks like the view, that possibility generates a contradiction. Contradictions can't be true, so we should reject that possibility here. Here's Parfit's response then. He says, we know what the outcome is. There will be 2 future people, each of whom will have the same body of one of my brothers and will be fully psychologically continuous with me. Remember, Parfit is challenging that traditional Lockean view that numerical identity matters in terms of personal identity, and that it's psychological continuity, which is the basis of that numerical identity. He says, knowing this, we know everything. I may ask, but shall I be one of these 2 people or the other or neither? But I should regard this as an empty question. This is what Parfit thinks of the traditional problem of personal identity then. He says, what happened? He gives an example of an empty question here. He says, here's a similar question. In 1881, the French Socialist Party split. It became two different parties. What happened? Did the French Socialist Party cease to exist? Or did it continue to exist as one or the other of the two new parties? Given certain further details, this would be an empty question. And he thinks the question of what happens to me in that fission thought experiment is also an empty question. He says, even if we have no answer to this question, we could know just what happened. He says nothing is missing. What is wrong can only be the duplication. Suppose that I accept this, but I still regard division as being nearly as bad as my death, the fission being as bad as my death, that I don't survive. My reaction is now indefensible. I'm like someone who, when told of a drug that could be double his years of life, regards the taking of this drug as death. The only difference in the case of division is that the extra years are to run concurrently, simultaneously, concurrently with one another. This is an interesting difference, but it cannot mean that there are no years to run. We might say you will lose your identity, but there are different ways of doing this. Dying is one, dividing another. To regard these as the same is to confuse 2 with the 0. Double survival is not the same as ordinary survival, but this does not make it death, and it is even less like death. The problem with double survival is that it does not fit into the logic of identity. Like several reductionists, I claim relation R is what matters. R is psychological connectedness and or psychological continuity with the right kind of cause. So he lays out two different relationships here. I'm quoting passages out of Derek Parfit's book, Reasons and Persons. Parfit's also very well known for his his thinking on the relationship between personal identity and ethics and moral theory itself. So he lays out these two different relations. He says, I can now define two general relations. Psychological connectedness is holding of a particular direct psychological connections, and psychological continuity is the holding of overlapping chains of strong connectedness. Of these two relations, connectedness is more important in theory and in practice. So he's saying this is what we really do and what matters to us, he thinks. He thinks that connectedness can hold to any degree. Remember, numerical identity required total sameness, total qualitative identity. Between X today and X yesterday, there might be several thousand direct psychological connections or only a single connection. If there's only a single connection, X and Y would not be, on the revised Lockean view, the same person. For X and Y to be the same person, there must be, over every day, enough direct psychological connections. So in the case of Morty getting some very important memories erased, not the same person. Since the connectedness is a matter of degree, we cannot plausibly define precisely what counts as enough. But we can claim that there is enough connectedness if the number of direct connections over any day is at least half the number of what would hold over every day in the lives of nearly every actual person. So not just thought experiment replicas, but actual people. When there's enough direct connectedness, there is what I call strong connectedness. And that, he thinks, is what matters. So here's Lay then. Lay's essay is about, which of these views of personal identity does the show seem to advance as a thesis about personal identity? So in the end, in the ABCs of Beth episode, we get the possibility of a clone Beth versus a real Beth. She wonders if she's a clone. So in the end, whether Beth is a clone or real Beth, the practical result is the same. By readmitting Jerry into her life, she has frustrated Rick's plans to put himself in a position of absolute authority in his family patriarch. Clearly, Rick's plans here don't have anything to do with Beth being a clone or not. This is what Rick wanted all the way from the top of season 3, long before there was ever talk of a clone Beth. What matters is that Beth, whoever she is, clone or the original, replica or the original, chose Jerry over her father, and not whether Beth is identical to real Beth. After all, the other real Beth, or clone would presumably do the same thing put in that position. So he continues here, second quote from the article. In both examples, it seems to me that this kind of continuity is all that matters to the Rick initiating the transfer. He's talking about where Rick is put in, you know, where Rick goes to tiny Rick, transfers his memories and consciousness into the new body. So he says, again, in both examples, it seemed to me that this kind of continuity is all that matters to Rick initiating the transfer. Again, short of believing in an immaterial soul that leaps between bodies, Rick has to see that consciousness cannot move between bodies without something in which it is realized. The only thing that gets passed through the brainalyzer or between tiny Rick and old Rick or in the teletransporter in Parfit's thought experiment is information about psychological states. So what matters in each iteration of Rick is that someone will carry his distinctive psychological pattern, his desires, intentions, beliefs, memories, that will get carried on. Not whether it is continuous with it, just that it's connected enough. Or we might say that what matters to Rick is Parfit's psychological continuity. So go back to the club example, or the sports team example. What matters, so to talk about a club over time being the same numerically identical club is to misunderstand the nature of clubs. There are parts of it that change, the name stays the same, but there are these overlapping and intertwined stages that go through, that are extended through time. What matters is not that there's same continuity of memories through all of them, but that there's just enough psychological connectedness to them. Right? So Parfit, according to Parfit, what matters is not identity over time, but psychological connectedness over time. And so according to that view, we might really be several different people over the course of the lives of our bodies, right? And sometimes we even talk this way ordinarily. We say that a person is not the same guy as he used to be, or the same person that he used to be, because some parts of their psychology have changed so much that they seem like a different person. That kind of idea here. Parfit then considers whether this is what should be the existential, the import of that result. Should we be depressed about that? Should I be sad that I don't survive, right? Or that I'm different people? He says, is the truth depressing? Some may find it so, but I find it liberating and consoling. Sorry, my phone just went off here. When I believed that my existence was a further fact, I seemed imprisoned by myself. My life seemed like a glass tunnel through which I was moving faster every year, and at the end of which there was darkness. When I changed my view, the walls of my glass tunnel disappeared. I now live in the same open air. There is still a difference between my life and the lives of other people, but this difference is less. I'm less concerned about the rest of my own life and more concerned about the lives of others. So for Parfit, well, let me back up. For Locke, it was the relationship that matters is whether I remember being myself. But this is like a view from the outside for Parfit. Right? So when I believed that personal identity was a further fact of importance, I also cared more about my inevitable death. After my death, there will be no one living who will be me. I can now redescribe this fact. Though there will later be many experiences, none of those experiences will be connected with my present experiences by chains of such direct connections as those involved in experience memory. There will be later memories about my life. My death will break the more direct relations between my past experiences and future experiences, but it will not break various other relations. This is all there is to the fact that there will be no one living who will be me. Now that I have seen this, my death seems to be less bad. So the upshot for Parfit is that what matters in terms of the self, what traditionally was called identity, is not the sameness, but psychological connectedness over time. And since memories and stuff go with my brain, it looks like over the course of time that the way we should think about persons is more like the nature of a club than sameness in the traditional view. So Lay's article, to like kind of wrap things up a little bit here. Lay's article, I believe, was written after season 3, and since Lay's article was published and our textbook was published, we've had a 4th season of Rick and Morty. So we can ask about the more recent episodes of Rick and Morty. Do they seem to support Lay's contention that what matters in Rick and Morty is something more like Parfit's view than Locke's view, even though the Council of Ricks seem to operate on something like the traditional or Lockean view? The show itself as a whole seems to give the impression that personal identity doesn't matter, which is Parfit's view, right? Well, we can ask if these more recent episodes from season 4, like Edge of Morty, or Star Mort Rick Turn of Jerry, do these episodes seem to fit with Lay's thesis, or do they seem to be contradictions of Lay's thesis? So something to think about there is the last question. If you've seen the more recent episodes, does the continued seasons seem to fit with Lay's thesis, or do they give us evidence against Lay's thesis about personal identity and what matters in Rick and Morty? All right, so as always, if you have questions about anything in the reading or in this lecture, beyond the reading questions themselves, which you should be able to find the answers to on your own, and I want you to find on your own as a way of studying. They don't help you learn the material if I just give you the answers to those questions. You should be able to find them in lectures and in reading assignments, or discern them from that material. So if you have questions beyond those, be sure and write them either in the discussion forum or bring them up during the live session that you will have for this unit. So with that, we wrap up personal identity. The next lesson is on epistemology. So I'll see you all for the next lesson.